Hey, wow, VIPers, that's very important perpetuators of accurate information. It's Sunday afternoon, March 22nd, and I've decided that whenever I go on live now, I'm going to give the date because literally things are going to be changing on a daily basis. So I don't want you to view this and then later look back and say, well, that was so idiotic. What did he say that for? Well, just keep in mind that things are changing daily. So my job, my commitment is to try to give you the most accurate, up-to-date information that I've curated from all my different sources so that you can stay informed. This is my way of fulfilling what I call that viral spiral. And if you don't know what I'm talking about on the viral spiral, go back to the previous video, the one where I have the lucky hat on, and look at that, and that explains what I mean. But in simply, the viral spiral is our way of flipping all this stuff on its head and making this a time for transformation, making this a time when we're going to take this awful situation and we're going to deal with it, and we're going to deal with it effectively, but we're going to deal with it in a way that's going to be transformative, going to change our lives and the lives of those around us. So my commitment to you is to come on here as frequent as I can to give you updates, information, accurate, curated information, which is critical, that's key, so that you can make better decisions for you and your family and those that are around you. So I wanted to answer a couple of quick questions, and then I've gotten so many questions, and there's so much information out there right now on the hydroxychloroquine that I wanted to address that particular issue specifically today. Now, that information may change tomorrow, but at least for today on the 22nd, it is accurate. The first question I get is people are confused somewhat by the terminology. Just know that when you hear the term SARS-CoV-2, that's the same as the novel coronavirus. That's the name of the virus itself, SARS-CoV-2. The actual disease that it causes is COVID-19. I know that's not a big distinction, but it's important to understand some of the basics because you can help differentiate as you read articles about this information. And also keep in mind, this is the third pandemic really, caused by coronaviruses in our recent past. The first was back in 2003, and that was the SARS-CoV-1. That's why this is now SARS-CoV-2. And that was initiated in Asia, and that was back in 2002, 2003. And then in 2012, many of you remember the MERS, M-E-R-S, and that standing for the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus. You know, it's interesting that you didn't really have too many people complaining about it being called MERS, Middle East virus, whereas now everybody's complaining about it being called the Chinese virus. I'm not going to get into the politics or semantics of that, but just know that was the second pandemic by a coronavirus. And remember, coronavirus is the umbrella term that many of these viruses fall under. A lot of coronaviruses are responsible for just regular colds, but this SARS-CoV-2 is a specific, different, unique, novel coronavirus that is causing this particular pandemic. But just know this is the third one we've had since the early 2000s. And this one's different because of its infectivity and its relative benign nature. Now, what do I mean by that? It's kind of the perfect storm. It's a virus that does have a higher mortality than influenza, but it's very infectious. But a lot of the symptoms are very minimal, and that's a setup for transmission. If it was a virus that had a very high mortality like MERS did, then people who got sick were immediately isolated because they got a lot sicker, therefore they weren't in the circulation contaminating and spreading the virus. But most of the people that get sick with this virus don't really have a lot in the way of symptoms. So by its nature, the fact that you can shed the virus within 4 to 6 days before you actually develop symptoms creates an environment where you're actually more likely to disseminate it. So that's why this has become a bit different than some previous epidemics that we've seen. And it's really due to the mild nature of the virus for most people, and the fact that it is easily what we call the R naught, or the infectivity. Just for influenza or for measles, for example, for every person who gets measles, you can expect to infect 12 people. The R naught for the SARS-CoV-2 virus is looking to be about 1 to maybe 3 or 4. So for every person who gets infected, they are likely to infect 3 or 4 other people. Just to give you some context, with influenza, it's about 1 to 2 or 3. So it's more infectious than that, but it also, remember, because it's mild, many people are out into the circulation. Of course, not now with the social isolation, which is the whole reason behind the social isolation. That's why we're doing this, is to flatten that curve, to prevent that relative frequent transmission by all those people who don't even know they're carrying the virus. That's the importance of it. Got a couple of recent questions about kids, about the effect on kids. Some of the data that we have coming out of China and out of Italy shows that children are infected. They can be carriers. The good news is they tend to have a much milder expression of the disease. But it's important, because the fact that they are carriers, that they still need to participate in the social isolation and all the quarantining that's going on, because they're as equally likely to be carriers of the disease, even though they have a milder version of it. They're much less likely to be hospitalized, but they still need to be isolated. So don't take them around don't take the grandkids over to the grandparents. I mean, this is just a time to be cautious and to be smart. Just because kids are less affected doesn't mean they're less infected. I think that's an important point that I want each of you to remember. All right, well, let's talk just briefly about this issue about this hydroxychloroquine. In the U.S., the brand name is Plaquenil. Many people may know it by that. And you're hearing two forms. People talking about chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Chloroquine is an anti-malarial drug that was developed back in the mid-1930s. And it was used predominantly to treat malaria, and is still used to treat malaria. Now, the problem with chloroquine is it had a lot of side effects. It was not tolerated that well by people. However, the benefits versus the risk, get malaria or cure malaria, outweighed the side effects of nausea, headaches, a lot of other unpleasant side effects of the chloroquine. Well, in about the 1950s, there was a variation of the molecule. Basically, they added a hydroxyl group in one of the areas, and that's where you get hydroxychloroquine. So it is a form of the drug that's much better tolerated. And that's important because oftentimes with malaria, the drug has to be taken over a period of time. But really in the 1970s is when we began to see much more use of this drug for things like lupus or rheumatoid arthritis. It was determined that this medication had somewhat of an anti-inflammatory effect. It reduced the immune response, and as many of you know, with something like lupus, which is an autoimmune disease, the problems arise when your own body kind of rejects your own tissues. So what this drug did is it suppressed that event. It decreased that inflammatory reaction in rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. And by its very nature that these diseases are chronic, ongoing, long-term, oftentimes the medication was used long-term. So it was important that we develop this hydroxychloroquine to be used and much better tolerated over a long period of time. So what we're finding is that this drug has been used in the past to treat other viral illnesses. Now, this is a very important point. Every virus is a little bit different. Notice that the other name for the SARS-CoV-2 virus is a novel coronavirus. That means new. So we can't exactly analogize what worked with one particular virus works with another. Take the flu vaccine, for example. There are many different strains of flu. The flu vaccine may protect against some, but because the protein coat of the virus is a little different, and we're seeing this with this particular coronavirus. What happened for other viruses in the past might not necessarily translate to this virus. Well, why did people become even interested in looking at this? Well, there was a number of studies done back a few years ago in what we call in vitro, meaning in the test tube, where they saw that hydroxychloroquine was able to reduce viral replication. And that's important. That's important because that's how a virus invades the system. It gets into a cell, in this case, a cell called a pneumocyte, which is a cell in the lung, and that's why this is a respiratory problem. But it gets into that cell, it replicates, it produces gobs of itself, and then it bursts open and it destroys the cell. Well, in particular, the cell that it destroys in the lung produces a chemical called surfactant. Many of you know that, especially if you've had a baby, a preterm baby. Well, the big problems preterm babies have is they're not producing enough surfactant to keep their lungs open. Well, this is what happens. It destroys those cells, so these lungs collapse. You look at these x-rays of these people who have this pneumonia, and it's just like it's whited out, like their lungs are just full up of fluid. And that's why this can be so severe in people who are compromised, people who have other risk factors. Well, what the hydroxychloroquine has been shown to do is possibly interfere with the virus getting into the cell to start with. It blocks and helps prevent the virus from attaching to the receptor. It's like a lock and key that then brings it into the cell. So it kind of blocks that process from the very beginning. And then in addition, there's evidence that once it gets into the cell, it helps reduce the replication of that virus. So that's all very encouraging. Now notice what I said at the beginning. That's in vitro. That's in the test tube. We have very limited studies in what we call in vivo, in humans, in regular patients. What we're beginning to see are studies out of China, we have one out of France, that are beginning to look at how this drug interacts in the human system. And some of the studies are encouraging, but this is an incredible, important caveat. They're in very low numbers. For example, a study, and literally these studies have been published in the last week to 10 days. So we're talking about stuff that's coming out so rapidly that it's even being published without a lot of peer review. So we've got to take it a little bit critically. And I've actually looked at both the studies that have gained the attention of the world in the last couple of days. These are now being published. And I've actually gone through and looked at those studies. And there's a couple of important things that you've got to know. The study coming out of China that prompted the Chinese equivalent to the FDA to come out and say that they recommend the use of hydroxychloroquine was based on 100 patients. That's all. Now, just to give you some context, whenever we're studying a drug to see whether it's efficacious or whether it's safe to use in this country, for example, oftentimes these drug trials have many thousands of patients and they extend over several years. That's why it costs several $billions to get drugs approved in the country today. So this study out of China that they're basing this recommendation on from the Chinese government had exactly 100 patients in it. There was another study that was literally published 2 days ago that was out of France that looked at 36 patients that were taking hydroxychloroquine, and interestingly enough, in combination with zithromycin. Many people know that as a Z-Pak. It was some patients were taking just the hydroxychloroquine, some people were taking the Z-Pak with the hydroxychloroquine. But this study was just based on 36 patients. So it's critically important to understand that what we're getting in information is very, very preliminary. A lot of the early excitement was simply based on test tube and animal mice studies, and the human studies will come, but they're not so far in advance now that we can say a whole lot about true efficacy. Certainly, we have some data on safety because these medications have been used for 40, 50 years. I'll touch on safety in just a minute. So at least we have that experience to know that that part of the balance is a little bit better. We already know we've got 50, 60 years of experience with these meds as far as safety and side effects. So at least we can take that piece of the equation out to some degree. Now we just have to really nail down efficacy. So what are they looking for in particular in this French study? Basically, they took these patients who tested positive for COVID-19, and they were in the hospital. These were people who were in the hospital, and they did swabs and they tested them that they were positive. They started them on this regimen of hydroxychloroquine, and then every day they would again test them for the presence of the virus. And essentially what they showed is that by day 5 and 6, that a substantial portion of the individuals had either no viral load or much less viral load than people who were not treated with the medication. So in this very, very small study, there was some positive to be brought out from that. Now again, when you're dealing with a very small study, it's very difficult to show significance. It's very difficult to show that this can be translated into actual clinical use. Now let me make another very important distinction for you all to understand. There are essentially 3 levels of treatment we're talking about here. There is treatment of people who actually have COVID-19, who have been tested positive for the virus. There is what we call prophylaxis. That is using hydroxychloroquine for people who have been exposed to people, family members, healthcare workers, people who are not tested positive yet, but have been exposed. That's what we call prophylaxis. And then we have the third category called prevention. And that's basically folks like you and I who are saying, wow, should I get some of this and should I take it just in case? Will it protect me? Will it be able to keep me from getting the virus? And those are 3 very different tiers of action. Let me start with the treatment phase. That's the only area that we actually have any data on. Every single study that's been done to this date is strictly on people who test positive, who are either hospitalized or expressing symptoms. We have absolutely no data on whether people from a prophylactic standpoint or from a prevention standpoint, whether using this medicine will have any benefit at all. Critical distinction, especially when you think about reserves and you think about access to this medicine. Just in the last day, there's been several of the pharmaceutical companies, Teva, Bayer, several of the other large pharmaceutical companies are saying they are ramping up their production of this medication because we really haven't used that much of it in the U.S., certainly not for malaria, which is not a big problem in the U.S. Now, a lot of people who use it for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus have used those, but not nearly to the level of what we would need in this country in a normal production. So a lot of these companies literally in the last 24 hours have said they are going to ramp up the production of this medication to make it available. But when you think about the numbers that have been quoted so far and you think about how this is dosed, at least initially, maybe for the next 2 or 3 weeks, the vast majority of the pills that are being produced are going to have to go to people who are in the treatment phase, people who are testing positive, who are having symptoms, who are in the hospital. That's just a numbers game. When you look at the volume that's needed, it's going to have to go to those individuals. That being said, probably the next tier where those medications will be applicable will be to prophylax. If we can begin to get some data that indicates taking it will help prevent those people who are exposed. Obviously, we're talking about tiers of importance here. This is a public health issue. So we have to take what resources we have and apply them in the most effective and efficient place. That third tier, you and me walking around out there, or hopefully not walking around out too much out there, that's quite honestly way down the road as far as knowing whether it's going to either be efficacious or if it's going to be available. My guess is there will be enough available as all these pharmaceutical companies ramp up their production, but that's not going to be for a while. And that's a good thing, because quite honestly, the bar for that has to be a little bit higher. You have to know that if you're giving well people something, it has to first do no harm. And again, I'll get into some of the harmful effects of this. It's not just like drinking water. But two, you don't want to take away the resources from people that you know it might benefit who are already in that situation. I hope that's clear. I hope people understand that's very, very important. So what are some of the potential side effects? Well, I mentioned some of the mild things like headache, like diarrhea, like visual changes, like upset stomach, GI complaints. But there's actually several more serious potential side effects. One of the most is what we call a prolongation of the QR interval and the QT interval. These are related to how the heart functions. And without going into a lot of the physiology, just know that these medications sometimes can change the heart rhythm and can cause certain rhythm disturbances, and especially in people who are on other medications that can do that. Well, what are some other medications that potentially can do that? Well, certain anti-nausea medicines, certain depression medicines. So very commonly used medications can actually extend that QT interval, and that can be magnified by going on this medicine. So you actually can create problems for people who are already on certain medications. We know that, I want to make sure I get all this correct, because this is really a very important consideration as far as side effects. I was talking about drug-drug interactions. It can sometimes interfere with certain medications like digoxin, people who are using that for arrhythmias. And if you think about it, most of the people who are getting treated, again, are over 65, over 70, have multiple morbidities. And these are the people who are on these medicines. So physicians are going to be very vigilant about who they're using this on, and not doing more harm than good, especially if we don't really know how much benefit it's going to get. And that's further reason that just Billy Bob and Aunt Sue out there walking around with no evidence of infection should not be taking these medications, because it can interfere with other things that are going on, and you could actually end up in a situation that's worse. These are not like vitamins. These are not like water. These are not like something you just want to go down and grab and take, because it potentially can have serious side effects. In fact, most physicians who are treating people in the hospital are having to rely on clinical pharmacists to really differentiate what is the potential side effect of this medicine, given that many of these people are on multiple other medications. Trying to see if there was anything else common that I wanted to make sure of as far as side effect profile. I guess my big point is that every medication has potential side effects, and you don't want to be basing your decision about trying to do something on a tweet. And I got to say this, I've got to say this, and I don't mean this politically, but for the President of the United States to tweet out at this stage that the use of hydroxychloroquine and zithromycin is a game changer is so ridiculously premature. I mean, Dr. Fauci tried to come out and explain that and to walk that back a little bit. And I promise you, if anyone's out there thinking this is a political statement, it says more about you than it does me. This is a scientific statement. We are not at a place to be putting out that kind of information from a scientifically and a medical background. That's just inappropriate. There are a lot better ways of expressing the reality of this situation than to put something out like that without any context. That's just my soapbox for the moment. So please don't take that the wrong way. I tell you what is interesting is some of the information that we're seeing on what we call convalescent serum. That's a treatment protocol where people who have recovered from the COVID-19 disease, they get their antibodies and they purify those, and then they take that and give those to people who are sick. There's some promising work being done on that. There's several antiviral mechanisms that are being, or drugs that are being investigated. Now, 2 weeks from now, or a week from now, heck, tomorrow, there may be more data coming out on hydroxychloroquine, and it may be more promising. And I hope it is. That is my hope. But my promise to you is to provide you the most up-to-date, accurate information, whether it's good or bad. I think knowledge is power, and the application of the knowledge is a superpower. But I wanted to I just felt compelled to get that out to the WOW community, and hopefully that clarifies some information. Don't go out and ask your doctor for a prescription for hydroxychloroquine, because chances are the pharmacies are not going to have it available unless you meet certain criteria, because of currently it's short supply. You're not going to be able to just walk in and get, nor should you at this point. Again, it's proper hygiene, it's being smart in social isolation, that's in maximizing your immune system with nutrition, sleep, exercise. Those are the things that are going to be proven to be effective at helping to minimize your risk. Now, my hope is it'll change, and the minute I hear something different, you guys are going to be the first to hear about it. So that's all I had to say today. Let me look on here. Hey, Dina, Tamara, Jana, Judy, Becky, Mickey, Angie. Listen, again, my goal over these next 2 to 3 weeks is to provide you as much accurate information as I can. If you have specific questions that you want answered, and I'm looking up here right now and see if I can answer any of those. If you have any specific questions, please either message me or put them on this feed. Remember, our office is only going to be seeing OB patients for the next couple of weeks. We do have some slots for GYN emergencies, so feel free to call. But we really want to push folks towards our telemedicine platform. That's a very simple tool where you can get your needs met, you can get seen, you can have the consultation on any kind of problem you're having by going to our website. We've got information on there. I'll put the link up there for me personally. All you have to do is click on that link, and you can get a calendar that shows my availability, and I'll have a conference with you about anything you might need to do. And the same thing goes for the other doctors in our practice. I think this is going to be a new era for telemedicine, and you guys can be on the forefront of that. So, that being said, please feel free to invite any family or friends to join us. All you have to do is go up and put their name in where it says invite. Put their name in, then I can approve them. Family, friends, colleagues, anyone you think may benefit, especially as we enter into this very intensive information overload over the next several weeks. I'd love to do my part. That's part of what I call my viral spiral in turning this up. And remember, take care of yourself and your family first. Number 2, do a random act of kindness at least once a day for someone. And number 3, use this as a transformational wake-up call to change your health in mind, body, and spirit towards a positive. But most of all, make healthy choices.